Hey, Joe Walsh, White Flag Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'm a fairly lousy promoter, so I'm always being reprimanded to promote more. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, White Flag with Joe Walsh. Doesn't cost a damn thing. Excuse me. Subscribe and listen to your podcasts wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple, all of that good stuff. Follow me on Twitter at Walsh Freedom. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. I don't know what it is, and I'm going to turn it over to the man who does know what we're doing. Michael Elliot is a film editor, a longtime film editor in New York City. Michael, welcome. It's so good to be with you. The show is yours, brother. That's all the intro I'm giving you.
Hi, Joe.
Good to see you, my friend.
How you doing this week?
I'm tired, but I'm tired every week.
God, it's, news-wise, it's been quite an active period of time.
Buckle up, Buster, because this is the next 2 years, I'm afraid.
Oh, my God. Yeah, I guess so. Or even longer,
Even longer. I think that's right.
So I wanted to talk about guns, Joe.
Oh, you would?
Yeah. And what prompted me was that I watched your podcast with Fred Guttenberg.
Fred Guttenberg, yeah.
And there was just something that happened in the dynamic of that conversation that it pained me. And it got me thinking about...
and by the way, Michael, can I interject for 1 sec?
Yeah.
Just so everybody knows, Fred Guttenberg, great guy who lost his daughter Jamie in the school shooting down in Parkland, Florida, now 5 years ago. He and I have become friends, even though we disagree on the issue. But Fred Guttenberg, everybody should follow. He's a great guy. Continue, Michael.
It's okay. And it left me really wanting to talk to you about, not so much what transpired, but it made me want to just talk about the issue in a different way.
Okay.
And with some strategies that I've discovered shooting documentaries and talking to people a lot. And but I'm not like you, which is that I've never been out on the road. I've never spent time in the public eye. Mm-hmm. And I'm a lonely film editor. We sit in this dark room by ourselves and we observe behavior in people. Yeah. And we have a one-way conversation, which is that they talk to me and I look for in the context of them talking to me, I look for and try to present them as their authentic selves.
Interesting.
So what I wanted to do today was I wanted to reflect on what I know about your position on gun ownership. Mm-hmm. And as I go through your position, you can stop me along the way, and I will stop along the way. Okay. To make sure that I really hear you, and that I've got your the ideas right, and that I've got your feelings about the issue. I want to present your authentic self.
Okay.
And as I know you, and I want to, kind of make sure that it's accurate and that I really get to the heart of your feelings. Mm-hmm. So I want to start from the beginning, which is, and your audience is going to know this, which is you grew up in a suburb of Chicago, traditional large family. You've often said that you started getting your political thinking started really with your mom.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm pretty certain of is that you've got a really powerful reverence for the country's founding documents. Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Bill of Rights, the amendments. And embedded in those documents is a belief that individuals are making their own choices, living their life, and hopefully without the weight of an omnipotent government lording over you.
Perfectly.
Would I have that?
Perfectly.
Would I have that right?
Perfectly put, Michael. Yes, thank you.
And it's no surprise to me, or to you, I'm for sure, that the Second Amendment to the Constitution is about an individual's right to bear arms. And so when you refer to the sanctity of the Second Amendment, It comes with the belief that it's a very clear, it's very clearly articulated that it comes from a place where of a deeply held value that self-protection, self-sufficiency aren't something trivial or to be toyed with by a government.
Mm-hmm.
Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So when people talk about government infringing on the right to bear arms, that very quickly raises your concern about using governmental laws and observation to restrict a right that is so clearly stated in the founding documents.
In fact, Michael, if someone, I'd feel the same way if someone threatened to take away my right to defend myself with a gun. I'd react the same way I would if someone took away my right to speak my mind.
Yeah, there's a inside of that you've expressed in our conversations this kind of a reverence for where what their intentions were, regardless of the language or the interpretation of language. It's a deeply held belief that isn't trivial, and I think that's it's a very much of a cultural and there's almost a kind of faith-based perception of it. It's really deep, and I could see that in your conversation with Fred. And so,
let me add. Can I add one thing, Michael?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what I believe, and I don't know what's going to happen after we die. I've always been enamored with the idea of reincarnation. There's a part of me that believes I was around during America's founding. I've always been uber fascinated with that time period, and the idea of I love this country, as I know you do. We're the only country founded upon an idea in the history of the world, and that idea is freedom. And what we did to create this country, to literally create a society based on freedom, flaws and all, is so powerful to me. I've said publicly, so I can't take this back, and I wouldn't take it back. The Second Amendment is the only thing I'd add, Michael, to everything you said. In many ways, I've said, is kind of our last line of defense. In many ways, it's our most important freedom, because I do believe there's solid evidence that our founders and others believed at the beginning it was there as well, like our last line of defense against a government that would take away all of our other rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm going to get to that piece of your values, but I'm concentrating on the Second Amendment because it's very specific to what we're talking about today, and but it's clearly a global, perception of those founding documents, and they all have a level of importance. Okay, but you're also aware that, even in the context of those documents, that with that right comes an enormous responsibility, because these tools are designed to take a life, whether you're hunting or whether it's for personal protection. And you do see that as linked to self-sufficiency and self-protection. So it's an essential right rooted in survival. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about, an individual's right to bear arms, it's emotionally charged for you because you so clearly see it as something that can't be addressed by removing the issues of gun violence, can't be addressed by removing that right from you or from any citizen of the country, unless the reasons that individual might lose that right remain true to the founding documents.
Yeah.
And to the laws that govern civil society.
Yes. And
do I have that right?
You have that right. I'd only interject 2 points here, Michael. And I think you just kind of said this in other words. No right is absolute, and none of the rights are absolute. But again, I want to emphasize this. this whole discussion about the Second Amendment, I would be reacting in a similar fashion if we talked about the First Amendment.
Absolutely. And I'll restate that, which is that we're just focusing on this particular one. We could run this loop on any individual amendment. And it would have to start with that kind of fundamental belief. Because there's a real important aspect to it, which is, kind of what we're getting to. So I think when you see the issue, as a demand for individual self-sufficiency, the founders, they made a demand on us where by design, they sought to limit the powers of government because they came out of a time of authoritarian monarchies that wielded unchallenged power over their citizenry. And to make that brief, gun ownership is an issue of personal responsibility linked to our self-sufficiency. So when anyone comes along talking about, limiting your right, it runs counter to that, a very deeply held value for you. And you're concerned that government has to remain limited because by its nature, the more control it exercises over people, the more control it's going to seek. And so that Second Amendment issue is kind of it's a red line for you.
Yes.
Like it's something that setting aside the carnage that's happening in the country right now, it's a red line in terms of that foundational belief in that government and its role in your life has to be limited.
It's a red line. The taking away of that right would be a red line. Always understood, again, that right is not absolute. And so we debate and discuss how to moderate and how to regulate that right.
Mm-hmm. And when you say it's not absolute, you would place limitations on that because when you say it's not absolute, what do you mean?
I mean that not everyone can and should have the right to bear arms. So the right should not be equally applied to anyone. Society has a vested interest in taking away that right from people who we determine may harm themselves or others, people who have a history of harming themselves or others. The right of self-defense, Michael, the only other thing I'd add is and we've determined that in this country, I can't have an automatic weapon. I can't have a machine gun. I can't have more powerful weapons than that. So we do place, I have to go through a background check when I purchase a firearm to make sure that I'm not a bad or a crazy guy or I've got a record. So we do place some limits on that right. Mm-hmm. Again, analogous, Michael, to my First Amendment, my free speech rights. Yes, I've got free speech rights, but there are certain limitations that we've placed on that as well.
But it's a tricky subtlety, isn't it?
Oh, God, yeah. And the very discussion of regulating that right gets my cackles up.
Mm-hmm. And it's tricky because it has to do with who's determining, who's making that determination. And, in this country, it's like we don't, particularly when it comes to mental health, there are a lot of restrictions on limiting a person's right to move around in the world, even if they demonstrate that they are incapacitated or incapable of taking care of themselves. We still err on the side of personal responsibility and self-sufficiency. Would you say that's...
Yes, and
you agree? And you would agree with that,
yeah, and
right?
Historically, Michael, that's always where I've erred. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, in your view, this isn't trivial stuff we're talking about, okay? And it cuts right to the heart of what freedom means to you. And it's not buried in other language. It's spelled out in the Second Amendment. Number 2, not the 22nd, not the 5th, not the 10th. It's not the first, but it's the second. So clearly, this was at the forefront of what the the originators, the founders, it's clear that it was a really important issue because it comes right at the very beginning.
Joe Walsh here, governmentauction.com. It's a live auction site where you bid against other people interested in land, jewelry, coins, all kinds of collectibles, even Rolex watches. Have you ever wanted a 40-acre plot of land in Texas or Wyoming? Governmentauction.com has it. If you're the winning bidder, you don't need to go through credit checks. You just make a few down payments, keep your monthly payments going for a few years, and the land is yours. While you're making payments, you can use the land just like you would if you owned it. I know I've always wanted a big piece of land where I could go and just hang out, hunt, or hang with my dogs. And it's easy to sign up and start bidding on something that catches your eye. Go to governmentauction.com. It takes less than 5 minutes. Governmentauction.com.
So have I missed anything about that?
No. And again, we're 240 some years removed from it, Michael. And that's why this discussion is often odd, because I still feel that sense of urgency in defending that right, even though we live in a much different time right now. There's kind of a weird juxtaposition there. To me, it's a very simple thing. As a citizen of this country, I'm born with that right of self-defense, that Second Amendment right. Now here we are. We live in a country where we have guns that are capable of much more carnage. It's a much more complicated, dangerous world right now. And to be talking about the Second Amendment and what our founders meant just seems kind of odd right now with, mass shootings going on often.
Well, I mean, you have to realize it's like they didn't have this.
True.
Okay. And so the technology, we're talking about the difference in culture and society where, in the 18th century, they're basically climbing out of the primordial technological ooze.
Bingo.
And we're living in a highly technological society where there was no ability for them to imagine this is a totally alien environment in terms of their experience at the time.
But I think, Michael, you're right, but I think their basic truths still hold, even when it comes to that smartphone you put up and the right to free speech and a free press. At their core, they still hold.
Well, we don't love, Greek mythology for no reason,
yes.
Which is that those essential human truths, about our frailties and our gifts remain the same thousands of years later.
Yeah.
So, I would kind of add to that it appears that we remain the creature that we were at our origin, which is that yet we, as tool makers, we have surrounded ourselves with a level of tool making and a level of technology that could not be imagined at that time. But we are still these beings, and our frailties and our gifts remain very much intact. So as somebody who holds very different views from you, I just want to say that it's clear to me that, you've given this a lot of thought.
Yes.
And I can see why you feel this way. And without going too far into, the, one-on-one and, personal conversations, I have to assume that you know how to use a gun. Yes. And that you've spent some time training yourself for that use, and that you take the responsibility very seriously.
Yes, on all fronts, yeah.
And I'm also certain that you see it as an issue of self-preservation. And knowing where you've come from and what's happened to you over the past decade, I can say that, from my point of view, even though I have very different views, I could say that it would be terribly irresponsible of you to move through this world and not have the skill and the training, not for hunting, but for self-protection. And because you pissed off a lot of people who might not have that self-control that you possess?
Because of the journey I've been on, Michael, I live with daily and weekly threats. And so I've obviously gotten myself properly trained a while ago, but I'll do whatever I have to do out there to protect myself.
Mm-hmm. And that cuts to the heart of the issue, which is it's embedded in those documents, and it's embedded in that, for the very reason of self-sufficiency, which is you got to be able to feed yourself. And this is coming from the context of the time it was written, but you also had to be able to protect yourself.
Yes.
That it was a dangerous world in different ways than it is now. Also, coming from the background that you come from, it's like you possess that sort of heartland belief in the founding story. It's a kind of reverence for our system of government and a deeply held belief that we need to exercise a level of self-sufficiency and that freedom that comes, from not asking the government to do everything for you, which is that when you ask for the role of government to be limited, what you're asking people to do is to take responsibility for themselves and responsibility for their communities and responsibility to self-regulate. And it's an expectation that comes that is the price of freedom. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I've said, Michael, and look, I know the world's changed and it's more complicated than it was then, but I believe if our founders came back today, I believe they'd all be terribly disappointed at how large government has grown and how much as a society we are dependent upon that government. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, but again, this is as it relates to the issue of guns and the Second Amendment. There's an expectation in the writing of that, which was that with freedom comes responsibility.
Yes,
personal responsibility that's unavoidable.
And Michael, personal responsibility to defend yourself and take care of yourself and your family and your property. Again, different time, but that was ingrained in every man back then, and we've lost a lot of that.
Yeah, and it's like, and I think that we would agree on this, which is that government control over our lives is a slippery slope, which is because always with power comes and with control comes the desire for more. It's I've said to you on a number of occasions that I feel that all human institutions are corrupt.
Yes.
And or corruptible.
Yes.
And that and that's that that Goethe line, which is that I don't deem myself there's no crime I don't deem myself capable of.
Yes.
And that's one of those essential human truths that could be reflected in the earliest writing that we have, that it remains true from thousands of years ago through now, which is that we really have to be careful of how much power we invest anywhere, because with that power, it's inevitable that there's a desire for more control.
And Michael, the only thing I'd add to that, without getting us astray, is the other aspect of giving more power and control to government is, in essence, when we ask government to do more for ourselves, I think we ask less of ourselves to do for each other. We ask less of us to take care of ourselves, our own families, our own communities. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a case to be made that a lot of these private institutions have entropied over the years.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I can see, in our conversations, it's like I have a sense of where that comes from for you. You were in a big family.
Yeah.
And, with a lot of kids around, parents are distracted, life's complicated, it's easy to get overlooked. And I think that, when we've spoken, it's like you've shared with me that kind of that sense of like, that you felt, growing up that you didn't get that kind of it's not that you didn't get the attention that you needed, but that you were one of many.
Yes.
And that when you look at it, what you translated that in a political realm is that the responsibility really rests with the community. So in your early life, your community is your family. And you're not looking for government or for authorities to come in and say, hey, family, this kid's neglected. You got to pay attention to him. You're saying that it is really the responsibility within that unit that everyone is taken care of, that everyone's needs are addressed, that everyone feels heard, and that everyone has a place in that environment. And in a sense, you're asking that on a cultural and societal level, which is that the responsibility really rests with the community, with the families that make up that community, and with the individuals within those families to make sure that their needs are met. So there's a kind of, you've translated those early feelings from your growing up in your family, not in a way where it's like, God, somebody should have come in and helped me.
Right.
Which is, you're saying it's like the responsibility was ours as a family to make sure that happened. And as you're translating that into the world, you want that to be a component of the way that we govern ourselves, which is really putting that burden of responsibility where it belongs instead of it being where on the outside from some authority that is not a portion of that family.
Well, and maybe
would I have that right?
You have that right, Michael. And I loved what you said right there. And maybe it's naive in the year 2023, but you said in the way we govern ourselves. I worry that there isn't a whole heck of a lot of governing of ourselves that goes on much anymore. I worry about that. And so then we look toward government and we ask government to govern us.
And I think that's an old belief. It's like it's got origins in the way that you grew up.
Yeah.
And you've the lessons or the what you generalized as a kid, you found to be have a presence in the world around you, and that you want the solutions to remain close to you.
And I don't know that you and I ever talked about this. I had a hard-ass father, an Irish disciplinarian, who said, Joey, figure it out. Joey, deal with it. You figure it out. That kind of thing. I grew up with that.
And that's a really, that's a kind of a belief born in something that akin to trauma, which is that it came with a penalty, a consequence. It's like, you got to live up to your responsibilities, or there's nothing but trouble that's going to meet you along the way. Not a bad life lesson, because it in fact is, we live in our consequences all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, are you surprised that an old lefty, somebody that is just absolutely diametrically opposed to you, have I done a good job of articulating the core of your beliefs?
Michael, no bullshit. You have articulated almost to a T, to my core, where this intrinsic, Second Amendment right, but my natural freedom-loving rights come from perfectly. And
I don't think that you're alone in these beliefs, which is that I think that in your tribe, which has ostracized you so at this point in time, but in your tribe, I think that a lot of people would have a shared experience with you in terms of your core beliefs in the role of government and the role of and your responsibility in the world, in terms of your your own survival, your own self-preservation, and your own ability to live up to the ideals that are represented in the founding documents.
Yes, my tribe is of the right. My tribe has always been this more pro-freedom, limited government tribe. I no longer belong to that tribe, I would argue, because my tribe to a large degree, abandoned much of that in obedience to something else. But especially, Michael, when it comes to the issue of guns, virtually everybody in my old tribe of the right would agree with what I said about the Second Amendment.
Mm-hmm. So you're really still not very far from them. You're still hold that closely held belief that limited government and the personal responsibility, self-sufficiency, it hasn't really changed. I mean, because the people may be swayed or they may be confused by the message that comes from grifter leaders. Yeah. But at their core, if you are visiting them in the community and you're said, let's put politics aside for a moment, let's just talk about who we are as people, there's a really a profound sort of shared philosophy there that I don't think has changed.
So, Michael, that's fascinating. If I went back and did my town halls in front of groups of my old supporters and followers and constituents on the right, most of them, almost all of them, would share my beliefs in what put us in the same tribe to begin with. Now, the difficulty is I would argue and debate with them that they've abandoned much of that belief system.
Yeah, but I don't want to make that,
No.
In this conversation, I don't want to make that judgment.
No, but at their core, Michael, they still would believe what we'd share.
Yeah, they were going to articulate a very similar. So if I was talking to them and I was relating to them about where this comes from.
Completely.
Joe, you're not a monster. You don't want to see children slaughtered.
No.
It makes you really uncomfortable. It's a horror. So, coming from a completely different place like I do, it would really be, I would be way off base in attributing motive and attributing judgment on you if I were to say something to the effect of like, well, you just don't care because all you care about is yourself and your, and your guns and your, I just would be, I wouldn't have gotten, how would I have this conversation that we're having right now?
We'd have turned this off 45 minutes ago.
Right.
Michael,
So now I'm going to ask you for something next, but go ahead.
I was just it pains me. When it comes to the Second Amendment and my belief in guns and self-defense, what we're living through now just pains me.
It's a horror.
Yes.
So, I believe you, okay, which is that there's nothing in the context of this conversation where I could say to you, it's like, what we've articulated here is what I would call personal truth. Okay, it's your truth, but it's a shared truth.
Yes.
It's a cultural proof. It's a societal one. These are not an uncommon set of beliefs, particularly in this country. So now
Michael, I'll say one more quick thing. I'll say, and I no longer belong to the NRA for other reasons, but I do not know of a gun owner. I do not know of a gun owner, and I speak to gun owners every damn day. I do not know of a gun owner on the day of or after a mass shooting who celebrates, rejoices, or is indifferent to such an event. Every gun owner, everybody on the right who I know is as pained and bothered and troubled by these as any American would be.
Mm-hmm. And I respect that. I do. Now I have an ask of you, which is that, can you flip this? Can you articulate my view on guns and American culture?
I could try. Probably not as skillfully as you did, my friend, but I could try. I would say, Michael Elliot, that you as well hold a pretty fervent view toward our founding fathers, correct?
I do.
And or certainly toward this experiment, as flawed as it is, this idea that they tried to set up, that they did set up. And I would guess that you would probably support in principle all of the rights, even the Second Amendment right, even if you and I disagree with exactly what the founders might have meant by that amendment. It's there, and I think you value it there, in theory. You do. I would say you value it as you would any other right.
That's partly true, but it's not really an articulation of my perception of what they were up to and what they were trying to do.
I would imagine that you would believe what the founders were up to was the other words in the amendment, the militia. That it was more of a collective right. Perhaps our founders meant it as more of a collective right than an individual right, possibly, without a standing army, that the people were called to be part of militias. And as an individual right, it may be much more limited. So maybe you viewed it much more as the founders might have as a collective right.
And what do you think I would, it's like if see, here's where we have our problem. This is what I wanted to get to, which is that it would be complicated for me. It would take a lot longer because we would have to go through this step by step, one question at a time, for you to be able to tease out the nuances of my, like, what formed my perception. Exactly. And so we could do that right now, but it would consume too much time. It would take us several hours, okay, in order for us, you and I, to step through. Because right away from the very inception, you're too granular in terms of the of where my perceptions. I would start in a general way, which is, how do I exist in the world? How do I feel about this?
Yeah.
And I'll what I will give you is that I've never owned a gun. I've never fired a gun.
Have you been around a gun that's been fired?
I've had a lot of guns pointed at me. And my views are shaped. I've grown up in big cities.
Yeah.
I grew up in Los Angeles. Then I moved to I lived a rural life in Northern California. Then I moved to New York City. I make my way through New York City at all hours of the day and night. I am only as I am. And that the protection that I invent for myself is based completely on my ability to navigate or mitigate risk. So I'm observational. I'm aware. I am distant. I block. I can be invisible. And I've learned that skill the hard way because, like I said, I've had a lot of guns pointed at me, but I have never felt the need I've never felt the need or the desire to use anything other to self-protect, using anything other than my ability to move through the world.
Michael, two questions. Have you had situations where you have felt your life was in danger?
I had a guy put a gun in my eye and cock it.
Okay.
On the street, on Fountain and Crescent Heights in Los Angeles.
And what happened?
It was a robbery.
Yeah.
I was with my wife, and we handed half the things, and I looked at the guy, and I said, you're shaking, and you don't need that. It's like, I'll give you what you want. It's like, I don't care. It's not worth my life. And he kept holding it, and I said, are you okay? And he's like, just hurry up. And I said, I'll go faster if you put it down.
And he put it down.
And he put it down. And he did it. It was, I don't want to attribute like why or how it occurred, but that wasn't the only time that's ever happened. I had a job in the rural place that I lived, and there was a guy in the community who, he was a vet. He was clearly suffering from severe PTSD, even though at the time we didn't know. And he walked into the place I was working one night, and he had his weapon of war with him. And he stood at the counter where I was, and he's like, and he looked at me, and he was like, just like scary eyes. And he said, I could kill you and I wouldn't even care. And I said, I'm sure you could. It's like, do you want some popcorn?
Michael, this is fascinating to me. 2 questions. You said that you've never felt the need or the desire to be able to have a gun in a situation like that to protect yourself. It makes me want to ask you, what would happen? What would you think would happen if you were in a position where you had to use a gun to defend yourself?
Well, that has to do with what I would call risk mitigation, which is that you approach risk in your life in a variety of different ways. And that if you, if you're a climber, if you're a skier, you bring risk to yourself. Mm-hmm. But, and because of the challenge, because it's interesting, because it's fun, and because it connects you to your, kind of like a primitive level of, that we're missing in this world that we live in.
Yeah.
And there are a host of strategies that you can use and to mitigate risk and to keep yourself safe, even in the context of an unsafe world or an unsafe environment. And those strategies, there are lots of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're not all equally effective, but they're all effective on some level. And my feeling about guns is always comes down to the fact that the chances are that at the moment that I need one, I won't have it. And that by the time I realize I need it, it will be too late. So with that as a concern, I can step back from that point of mitigation, and I can say, what tools would work were I to arrive at that party a little late? And we're getting off the topic here with what I really wanted to say. Yeah. But what I really wanted to say was that I've moved through my life for my 67 years in the absence of this tool, and I don't feel the need for it. And so that's from a philosophical standpoint, you would have to step back and say, how did you arrive at that strategy?
Well, yes.
Where does it come from? Like, what makes you think what are the core set of beliefs that would help you
choose
sustain
that strategy?
Yourself?
And Michael, that's where I would go. And the other place I'd go is kudos to you, because you've developed this, you've chosen this strategy, and you've effectively developed a skill in that strategy, because you've reacted very calmly in dangerous situations. Mm-hmm.
I can say honestly, I don't even have a clue where that comes from, because I'm quick to get hysterical and pressure. Yeah, but I would not fly a plane.
But you're also an observer. You're an observer of humanity. You're a very careful observer of humanity. So when someone sticks a cocked gun in your eye, you more than most, because of your observation skills, I would think would react to that in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I reported it and they asked me what he looked like, I said he was big and shiny.
Yeah.
So, but here's the place. Here's the place that we are, which is that I have a truth, okay? And I have a whole system of beliefs, like you do, that are founded in my history, okay? And that for us to have a real conversation, it's incumbent on each of us to be able to empathize and validate the history and the strategy and the ideas that that we possess, so that when we have a conversation about an issue that's near and dear to both of us, that we are coming to it with knowledge of each other that is very human.
Yeah.
And that comes from a place of a kind of deeper understanding of each other's role in philosophy. And to be honest, I've never done this demonstration with somebody who would represent the rights that that I've articulated for you, who has been able to flip it over and say, okay, I totally get you. Here's where you're coming from. Here's your history. Here's what you believe. I can totally see why you would feel that way. It's never happened. And I think that in the context of our conversation, that it's really important to be able to hear the humanity of the person that we're in disagreement with, or in adversarial relationship with, or that we are competing with, or that we're involved within community. That the missing component in this whole conversation that is like facts, and everybody's got their set of facts and everybody's got their proof. And, when you said on your show with Fred that you got angry at him when he expressed his views, that's what triggered, which is that I knew right in that moment, although you can empathize with Fred's point of view, you didn't understand where he was coming from.
Yes.
And I think that in a society with 400 million guns, like we live in, that there isn't a goddamn thing I can do about that. And I would turn it to you and I'd say, look, this is something that you're a right you represent. This is, it's a deeply held belief. I understand that. I accept that. Solve it, because you have unleashed on our country. We went from being a society of the founders. Speaking of context, we went from a society of the founders where bacteria and childbirth were the biggest killers of children. And it was rare that people lived past 30. And now here we are in a world where the scales are flipped, and it's ironic that it is rooted in this self-protection, self-sufficiency, that wonderful intention of the founders has become a catastrophe of epic proportions in our current society. And the idea that a gun, it's like the answer to a gun is a gun. It's like, I would say, great. So after Sandy Hook, what did we do? We went from 300 million to 400 million. So clearly we're more armed. And so did it help? Did we solve the problem? I'm just asking. Did we?
No, but I would just, the caveat I'd throw in, Michael, is this. 40 years ago, we had 180 million guns in this country. Now we have north of 400. The homicide rate and suicide rate via guns in the last 40 years is basically unchanged.
And we're on facts.
But I don't want to get on. You're right. But the problem of gun violence in this country is there. It has not been solved.
No. And so what that says to me is that, okay, so I think that in work, we cannot solve this until we are able to meet each other in a place of where we understand, where you would have that conversation with Fred and he could say to you, I see where you're coming from, which he did. And I empathize with it, but boom, here's the flip. And where you would be able to say to him, wow, I see where you're coming from. I understand your dilemma. We need to work this out.
Michael, you're spot on. And I wish the entire country could hear what you did with me, because we can't get to that conversation until we do what you and I did, because doing what you and I did, two things happened. You and I acknowledged each other's shared humanity, and you gained a greater understanding of where I'm coming from. So once you get those two things, then we can sit at a table over there and maybe...
Well, then we're not enemies anymore. We're just people.
We share humanity. We're just people.
We have kids. We live our lives.
Yeah.
We value the same things. We have essential truths, human truths that go all the way back to our primordial state.
So are you, Michael Elliot, are you saying that, stupid question, that as a society, as a people, we just go right to step 2 and 3? We don't do what you and I just did. We go shouting, we go to the facts,
You get triggered. You get angry. And you said it with Fred, and that's why I wanted to have this conversation.
He pissed me off.
He made you angry.
Yeah.
And the reason he made you angry is because